Harold Thompson sat in his favorite leather armchair, his weathered hands resting on the walnut cane that had been his companion for the past 5 years. Through the living room window, golden morning sunlight spilled across his neatly arranged collection of World War II photographs. At 93, he was the last surviving veteran in his neighborhood, a fact that sometimes made him feel like a living museum. Every morning, without fail, Harold followed the same routine he'd maintained since Dorothy, his wife of 65 years, passed away. He would wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m., brush his teeth with careful precision, and put on one of his 5 perfectly pressed plaid shirts. Today, he chose the blue one, Dorothy's favorite. Another beautiful morning, Harold mumbled to himself as he combed his thin white hair in the bathroom mirror. His reflection showed a face marked by time, but still holding on to a spark of youth in his bright blue eyes. The military discipline of his younger years had never left him, evident in how he smoothed every wrinkle from his shirt and made sure his collar was perfectly straight. As he stepped out onto his front porch, Mrs. Jenkins from next door was already watering her roses. "Good morning, Harold," she called out, waving her garden-gloved hand. "Heading to Martha's Diner again?" "Like clockwork, Sarah," Harold replied with a warm smile. "A man needs his routine." And his routine was something everyone in the neighborhood could set their watches by. Harold walked carefully down his well-maintained garden path, past the rows of vibrant marigolds and petunias he'd planted in Dorothy's memory. His 1965 Chevrolet Impala sat in the driveway, its forest green paint still gleaming thanks to the weekly waxing he gave it. The car had been Dorothy's last gift to him on their 60th anniversary, and he treated it like a precious jewel. The engine purred to life with a gentle turn of the key. Harold always patted the dashboard affectionately, remembering how Dorothy used to do the same thing. "All right, old girl," he said softly, "let's get our breakfast." The 5-minute drive to Martha's Diner was Harold's favorite part of the day. He drove past the elementary school where children would often wave to him, knowing him as the friendly old veteran who handed out butterscotch candies and told fascinating war stories during their history classes. Today, little Tommy Davis was waiting at the crossing with his mother, and Harold reached into his glove compartment for a candy. "Mr. Thompson," Tommy called out excitedly as Harold stopped the car and rolled down his window. "Are you coming to our class next week to tell us about the war?" "Wouldn't miss it for the world, soldier," Harold replied, handing Tommy the butterscotch candy. The boy's mother smiled gratefully. She knew how much these small interactions meant to both Harold and the children. Martha's Diner came into view, its red and chrome exterior shining in the morning sun. Harold carefully parked his Chevrolet in his usual spot, the one Martha herself had unofficially reserved for him with a hand-painted sign that read "World War II Veteran Parking Only. All others will be draft." The bell above the door chimed as Harold entered, using his cane more for balance than necessity. "There's our favorite customer," Martha called from behind the counter. She was already pouring his usual cup of black coffee, 2 sugars. Harold made his way to his regular booth, the one with a clear view of both the door and his beloved Chevrolet. The vinyl seats squeaked familiarly as he settled in, placing his cane carefully against the wall. "The usual, Harold?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. "Every day for the past 5 years, 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, crispy bacon, and a side of hash browns." "You know me too well, Martha," Harold replied, unfolding his paper napkin onto his lap with military precision. As he waited for his breakfast, Harold watched the morning crowd filter in. He knew most of them by name: the teachers from the elementary school, the mailman starting his route, the young mothers with their toddlers. They all greeted him with genuine warmth, some stopping by his booth to chat briefly about their lives or ask his advice. This was Harold's peaceful kingdom, his morning sanctuary where everything was predictable, comfortable, and safe. Little did he know that his cherished routine was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would force him to dig deep into his past and prove that even at 93, life could still surprise you. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Harold was just lifting his coffee cup to his lips when the peaceful atmosphere of Martha's Diner shattered. The deep rumble of motorcycle engines filled the air, growing louder until the windows began to rattle. 6 massive motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome pipes gleaming in the sunlight. "Oh dear," Martha muttered from behind the counter, her usual cheerful expression turning worried. "Those boys again." Harold watched through the window as the bikers dismounted their machines. They were all wearing black leather jackets with a red snake logo on the back, and their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his neck, strutted across the parking lot like he owned it. Harold's heart sank when he saw them heading straight for his beloved Chevrolet. "Nice grandpa car," the leader sneered loudly enough for everyone inside to hear. He ran a gloved finger along the Chevrolet's polished hood, leaving a dirty streak. "Must have been new during the Stone Age." The other bikers laughed, their voices carrying through the diner's thin walls. One of them, a younger man with a shaved head, deliberately parked his motorcycle so close to Harold's driver's side door that it would be nearly impossible for him to get in. Martha walked over to Harold's booth, refilling his coffee cup even though it was still half full. "Those troublemakers showed up last week," she explained in a low voice. "They're calling themselves the Red Vipers. Their leader goes by Spike." Harold watched as the bikers entered the diner, their heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor. They chose the largest booth, right next to his, and sprawled across the seats. The smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust filled the air. "Hey, Gramps," Spike called out, turning sideways to face Harold. "That dinosaur in the parking lot yours? Surprised they still let fossils like you drive." The other customers in the diner grew quiet, uncomfortable with the confrontation. Harold kept his dignity, calmly buttering his toast as if he hadn't heard the insult. His hands, steady through years of combat and hardship, didn't shake at all. "What's wrong, old-timer?" Another biker taunted, hearing aid not working. Martha approached their table, order pad in hand but steel in her voice. "We don't tolerate harassment in my diner, gentlemen. You're welcome to eat here, but show some respect." Spike raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just making conversation with our elderly friend here. No harm intended." But his smile was cruel, and his eyes stayed fixed on Harold with an unsettling intensity. Throughout his meal, Harold endured their whispered comments and mocking laughter. When he finally finished his breakfast and stood up to leave, one of the bikers stuck out his boot, nearly tripping him. Only Harold's quick reflexes, still sharp despite his age, kept him from falling. "Oops," the biker said innocently. "Didn't see you there, Gramps." Outside, Harold found himself staring at the motorcycle blocking his car door. You would have to squeeze through a tiny gap to reach his driver's seat. As he carefully maneuvered his way in, trying not to scratch either vehicle, he could hear the bikers laughing through the diner's windows. The drive home was silent. Harold's usual morning contentment had been replaced by a heaviness in his chest that reminded him of darker days, days he tried to forget. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed his hands were finally shaking, not from fear, but from anger. Inside his house, Harold walked straight to his study and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. There, wrapped in an old cloth, lay his military service revolver. He hadn't touched it in years, but its weight was familiar in his hands. Next to it was a small box containing his combat medals and a folded photograph of himself in his younger days, standing proudly next to a military motorcycle. Harold sat heavily in his chair, the photograph trembling slightly in his aged fingers. The young soldier in the picture stared back at him with confident eyes, leather jacket gleaming, helmet tucked under one arm. That was before the war, before he'd seen what real trouble looked like. "What would you do, Dorothy?" he whispered to the empty room. But he already knew the answer. His wife had always told him that bullies were just cowards who'd never faced real challenges. And Harold Thompson had faced more challenges than these young troublemakers could ever imagine. He carefully returned the revolver to its drawer. Violence wasn't the answer, it never had been. But as he looked again at the old photograph, a different kind of solution began to form in his mind. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold's peaceful life turned into a daily battle. The Red Vipers seemed to take special pleasure in making the old veteran's mornings miserable. They'd always arrived at Martha's diner just before him, taking up multiple parking spaces with their motorcycles and leaving him to park far away, a painful walk for his aging legs. One particularly cold morning, Harold found all 4 tires of his beloved Chevrolet flat. A small note tucked under the windshield wiper read, "Time to retire, old-timer." He stood there in the chilly morning air, staring at his disabled car while Martha called the local mechanic for help. "I've called the police 3 times now," Martha told him as she brought him a free cup of coffee while they waited. "They say unless the bikers do something illegal, there's nothing they can do." Her usually cheerful face was lined with worry. Maybe you should try coming at a different time, Harold. But Harold Thompson hadn't survived a war by backing down from bullies. That would just give them what they want, Martha, he replied quietly, watching through the window as Spike and his gang laughed and pointed at his car. The harassment didn't stop at the diner. The bikers had somehow found out where he lived. They would roar past his house late at night, engines deliberately revving to wake him up. His carefully tended garden was trampled one morning. The marigolds Dorothy had loved scattered across the lawn like fallen soldiers. Mrs. Jenkins from next door tried to help, taking photographs of the bikers with her phone as evidence. But Spike just posed for her camera, making rude gestures while his gang cheered him on. The whole neighborhood felt under siege. Even the children were affected. Little Tommy Davis no longer waited by the crossing for his morning butterscotch candy. His mother had seen the bikers following Harold's car one morning and decided it wasn't safe. The school canceled Harold's upcoming talk about World War II, worried that the bikers might show up to cause trouble. One evening, as Harold sat in his favorite armchair looking at old photographs, he heard the familiar roar of motorcycles approaching his house. Instead of passing by as usual, the engine stopped right outside. Through his living room window, he watched as two of the younger gang members crept toward his beloved Chevrolet, spray paint cans in their hands. Something snapped inside Harold. He grabbed his cane and moved faster than he had in years, throwing open his front door. "Get away from my car," he shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a military commander. The young bikers jumped, startled by his sudden appearance, but then laughed. "What are you going to do about it, Grandpa?" one of them taunted, shaking his spray can. Harold stepped onto his porch, standing straight despite the pain in his joints. "I've faced down real monsters in my time, boys," he said calmly. "Men who thought bullying others made them strong. Want to know what happened to them?" There must have been something in his voice, some echo of the soldier he'd once been, because the young bikers hesitated. In the streetlight, Harold's shadow seemed to grow larger, his silhouette transforming into that of a younger, stronger man. "Beat it, old man," one of them muttered, but Harold could hear the uncertainty in his voice. They backed away from the car, trying to maintain their tough appearance but clearly unsettled. As they roared away on their motorcycles, Harold remained on his porch, his heart pounding but his spine straight. He looked down at his hands, still gripping his cane tightly, and remembered how they had once gripped the handlebars of a military motorcycle, carrying messages through enemy territory. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the young men on their motorcycles, so confident in their power to intimidate others. They reminded him of himself at their age, before the war had taught him what real courage looked like. In his dreams, he was young again, feeling the powerful throb of a motorcycle engine beneath him as he raced through war-torn Europe. He woke up with first light, his mind clearer than it had been in weeks. He knew what he had to do. Harold walked to his garage, his cane tapping against the concrete floor as he made his way to the far corner. There, under an old tarp covered in decades of dust, sat something he hadn't looked at in 50 years, his old Indian military motorcycle. The musty garage air filled Harold's lungs as he pulled the heavy tarp away from his old military motorcycle. Years of dust swirled in the morning sunlight streaming through the small window. The Indian motorcycle's once gleaming chrome was now dulled with age, but Harold could still see the proud machine it had once been. "Well, old friend," he whispered, running his hand along the leather seat, cracked and faded from time. "Looks like we both got a bit rusty." The motorcycle had been his constant companion during the war, carrying him through dangers that still haunted his dreams. After returning home, he carefully stored it away, unable to part with it, but unwilling to relive those memories. Harold spent the next hour just sitting on an old wooden crate beside the motorcycle, his mind flooding with memories. He remembered the special motorcycle unit he'd served in, carrying crucial messages between Allied positions. They were called the Ghost Riders because of their ability to slip past enemy lines undetected. With trembling hands, Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Behind a faded photograph of Dorothy was his motorcycle license. He'd renewed it every 5 years out of habit, never really thinking he'd need it again. The latest renewal date showed it was still valid for another 3 years. "Dorothy always said I was silly to keep renewing it," he chuckled to himself, remembering how she'd tease him about it. Now it seemed like she'd known something he hadn't. Standing up with effort, Harold made his way to the workbench where he kept his old toolbox. Inside, beneath rusty wrenches and screwdrivers, he found a small black notebook. Its pages contained detailed notes about his motorcycle's maintenance, written in his much neater handwriting from decades ago. "Grandpa," a voice called from the garage doorway. "Mom said you wanted to see me?" Harold turned to see his grandson Michael standing there, looking confused. Michael was a mechanical engineer, something that had always made Harold proud. He'd inherited his grandfather's love for machines, though his expertise lay in modern engines. "Come here, son," Harold said, gesturing toward the motorcycle. "I need your professional opinion on something." Michael's eyes widened as he approached the old Indian motorcycle. "Is this from the war?" he asked, crouching down to examine the vintage machine. His hands moved expertly over the engine, checking various components. "She carried me through France," Harold replied, watching his grandson's face. "Think she has one more ride left in her?" Michael looked up, surprised. "You want to restore it?" His eyes darted between his grandfather and the motorcycle. "But why now?" Harold settled back onto his crate, his cane resting across his knees. "Remember those bikers I told you about?" When Michael nodded, Harold continued, "Well, sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to show them they're not as special as they think they are." For the next hour, grandfather and grandson examined every inch of the motorcycle. Michael took detailed notes, listing parts that would need replacing and systems that would require renovation. To Harold's relief, the engine's core was solid. His careful preservation had protected the most important parts. "It'll take work," Michael finally said, wiping his hands on a rag. "And some parts might be hard to find. But," he smiled, "we can do it. The frame's good, the engine block's intact. Give me a few weeks, and I can help you get her running again." Harold felt tears forming in his eyes. He hadn't realized until that moment how much he'd missed working on engines, the satisfaction of bringing a machine back to life. "Your grandmother would say I'm being foolish," he said softly. Michael put his hand on his grandfather's shoulder. "No, she'd say you're being brave. Standing up to bullies isn't foolish, especially when you do it with style." He grinned. "Besides, wait until those bikers see what a real motorcycle looks like." As Michael began making calls to vintage motorcycle parts suppliers, Harold opened his old notebook. The maintenance instructions were still clear, written by a young soldier who never imagined he'd need them again half a century later. "Just one more mission, old girl," he murmured, patting the motorcycle's weathered seat. In his mind, he could already hear the engine's powerful rumble, feel the familiar vibration beneath him. Those young bikers thought they owned the road, but they were about to learn a lesson from a real rider, a ghost rider from a time when motorcycles meant more than just making noise and causing trouble. Over the next 3 weeks, Harold's garage transformed into a busy workshop. Michael spent every evening after work there, and the bond between grandfather and grandson grew stronger with each passing day. Together, they carefully dismantled the old Indian motorcycle, cleaning and examining every part. "Look at this craftsmanship," Michael would often say, holding up various components. "They don't make them like this anymore." His engineer's eyes sparkled with appreciation for the vintage machinery. Harold would smile, remembering how he learned every inch of this motorcycle during the war, when his life had depended on keeping it running. The restoration became a neighborhood project. Mrs. Jenkins brought them sandwiches and lemonade, while her husband contributed his collection of vintage tools. Even little Tommy Davis would stop by after school, watching in wonder as the old motorcycle slowly came back to life. "Were you really a motorcycle soldier, Mr. Thompson?" Tommy asked one afternoon, carefully holding a polished piece of chrome that Michael had just restored. Harold nodded, showing the boy an old photograph of himself in uniform. "We were called the Ghost Riders," he explained. "Had to ride fast and quiet through dangerous territory. This motorcycle never let me down, not even once." The parts they couldn't restore had to be replaced, and Michael spent hours online searching for authentic replacements. Some came from collectors as far away as Europe, arriving in carefully packed boxes that Harold would open with trembling hands. Each new part brought them closer to their goal. But the work wasn't easy for Harold. His arthritic fingers struggled with small bolts, and bending over the engine made his back ache, yet he refused to give up. Every morning, before heading to Martha's diner to face the daily harassment from the Red Vipers, he would spend an hour in his garage, polishing and preparing parts for Michael's evening visit. The bikers, meanwhile, grew bolder. They'd taken to following Harold home some mornings, their motorcycles roaring behind his Chevrolet like angry wasps. They never noticed the knowing smile on his face as he drove, thinking about the surprise that awaited them. One particular challenge was Harold's old leather riding jacket. Time had not been kind to it, and the leather was stiff and cracked. Harold's daughter-in-law, a skilled seamstress, took on the project of restoring it. She carefully cleaned and conditioned the leather, restitched the weakened seams, and polished the metal zippers until they worked smoothly again. "Try it on, Dad," she urged when she brought it back. Harold slipped into the jacket, and suddenly he wasn't a 93-year-old man anymore. In the mirror, he caught a glimpse of the young soldier he'd once been. His military medals, carefully preserved all these years, gleamed on the front of the jacket. The biggest moment came when they were ready to start the engine for the first time. Michael had spent days adjusting the timing and checking every connection. A small crowd of neighbors gathered in Harold's driveway, everyone holding their breath as Michael pressed the starter. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a deep, powerful sound that made the modern motorcycles sound like toys. The vibration traveled up through Harold's cane as he stood nearby, and tears formed in his eyes. It was the same sound that had carried him through war-torn Europe, a sound he'd never forgotten. "She's ready, Grandpa," Michael said proudly, patting the motorcycle's seat. "Want to take her for a test ride?" Harold hesitated. It had been 50 years since he'd ridden a motorcycle. His family looked worried, but they knew better than to try to stop him. With Michael's help, he carefully swung his leg over the seat, settling into the familiar position. The handlebars felt right in his grip, like shaking hands with an old friend. Harold took a deep breath, remembering all the training, all the missions, all the times this motorcycle had saved his life. His muscles remembered too, muscle memory, Michael called it. "Just around the block," he assured his worried family. But as he gently opened the throttle and felt the motorcycle respond, Harold knew he was ready for more than just a short ride. The Ghost Rider was back in the saddle, and soon those young bikers would learn what real riding looked like. As he turned onto his street, neighbors applauding from their yards, Harold felt younger than he had in years. In 3 days, he would put his plan into action at Martha's Diner. But for now, he simply enjoyed the feeling of freedom that only a motorcycle could provide, the wind in his face carrying away the years like autumn leaves. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that seemed made for making history. Harold woke earlier than usual, his heart beating with excitement he hadn't felt since his war days. In his bedroom mirror, he carefully straightened the row of medals on his restored leather jacket, each one telling a story of courage and service. The Red Vipers always came to Martha's Diner in full force on Sundays, taking over the parking lot with their loud motorcycles and aggressive behavior. Today, Harold knew would be different. He had chosen this morning specifically for his plan. "Be careful, Dad," his daughter-in-law said as she helped him adjust his collar. Michael stood in the garage, making final checks on the restored Indian motorcycle. The chrome now gleamed in the early morning light, every part polished to perfection. "I survived a war on this bike," Harold reminded them with a wink. "A few local troublemakers don't worry me." Still, his family insisted on following him in their car, just to be safe. Even little Tommy Davis had begged to come watch, his eyes wide with excitement. As they approached Martha's Diner, they could hear the familiar roar of the Red Vipers' motorcycles. The gang was already there, their bikes lined up in their usual intimidating display. Spike stood in the center of his group, laughing at some joke. Harold stopped his motorcycle just out of sight around the corner. The rumble of his vintage engine was deeper, richer than the modern bikes, a sound that came from an era when motorcycles were built for purpose, not just show. "Ready?" Michael asked, standing beside him. Harold nodded, his hands steady on the handlebars. A Ghost Rider is always ready. He kicked the motorcycle into gear and turned the corner. The sound of his approach made heads turn. Harold guided the Indian motorcycle smoothly into the parking lot, the morning sun catching his medals and making them shine. The military grace of both rider and machine was unmistakable. Complete silence fell over the parking lot. The Red Vipers stood frozen, their mouths open in surprise. Even Spike seemed at a loss for words as Harold executed a perfect figure eight, handling the vintage motorcycle with the skill that came from years of combat riding. Martha came out of the diner, wiping her hands on her apron, When she saw Harold on his motorcycle, a huge smile spread across her face. Other customers crowded around the windows, watching in amazement. Harold brought his motorcycle to a stop directly in front of the gang, the engine's deep rumble echoing off the building. With practiced ease, he kicked down the stand and dismounted, his movement smooth despite his age. He removed his riding gloves and looked at the stunned bikers. "Beautiful morning for a ride, isn't it?" he said calmly, his voice carrying across the quiet parking lot. Spike stepped forward, his eyes moving from Harold to the motorcycle and back again. For once, the gang leader seemed unsure of himself. Is that a military Indian?" he asked, his usual mockery replaced by genuine awe. 1942 Indian 741B military model, Harold replied. "Served with me in the Ghost Riders unit during the war. Special operations behind enemy lines." He patted the motorcycle's seat. "She's seen more action than most bikes ever will." The younger bikers moved closer, drawn by the vintage machine's powerful presence. Harold could see the respect in their eyes, not just for the motorcycle, but for what it represented. "They don't make them like this anymore," one of the gang members said softly, bending to examine the engine. "No, they don't," Harold agreed. "Back then, we rode because we had to, because lives depended on it, not to frighten people or cause trouble." He looked directly at Spike as he spoke. The gang leader shifted uncomfortably, suddenly looking very young. The tough guy act had disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Little Tommy Davis couldn't contain himself any longer. He ran forward from where he'd been watching with Harold's family. "Mr. Thompson was a hero," he announced proudly. "He rode this motorcycle to fight bad guys." Harold watched as Spike's expression changed, looking at the old motorcycle with new understanding. Sometimes, he knew, the best way to teach a lesson wasn't through confrontation, but through demonstration. These young men had thought they knew everything about riding, but they were just beginning to learn what it really meant to be a rider. Martha brought out a cup of coffee, placing it on Harold's usual table by the window. The morning sun caught the Indian motorcycle's chrome, making it shine like a beacon of respect that would change everything at the diner from this day forward. The atmosphere at Martha's diner had changed completely. Spike stood silently beside Harold's Indian motorcycle, his fingers hovering over the vintage chrome without touching it, as if the machine was too sacred to handle. The rest of the Red Vipers gathered around, their earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. "My grandfather served in World War II," Spike said suddenly, his voice unusually soft. He pulled out his wallet and removed an old, creased photograph. "I never knew much about what he did, but he rode a motorcycle too." Harold took the photograph carefully, his eyes widening in recognition. The young soldier in the picture wore the same unit insignia he had worn, the Ghost Riders emblem. "Your grandfather was James Lightning Mitchell?" he asked, his voice filled with emotion. Spike's tough facade cracked completely. "You knew him?" "Knew him?" Harold smiled, reaching into his jacket pocket for his own wartime photograph. "He saved my life in France. We rode together for 8 months. He pointed to a young soldier standing next to himself in the picture, both of them leaning against their motorcycles. "That's him right there." The other bikers gathered closer as Harold and Spike compared the photographs. Martha brought out coffee for everyone, and soon the diner's parking lot became an impromptu classroom. Harold sat on his motorcycle's seat, sharing stories about the Ghost Riders and their vital role in the war. "We carried messages through enemy territory," he explained, pointing to various features on his Indian motorcycle. "Had to ride fast and silent. Your grandfather, Spike, he could ride through a forest at night without making a sound. That's how he got his nickname." Tears formed in Spike's eyes as he heard stories about his grandfather he'd never known. "He never talked about the war," he said quietly. "Died when I was 12. All I knew was that he loved motorcycles." "Many of us didn't talk about it," Harold nodded understanding. "But we never forgot. Your grandfather was one of the bravest men I ever knew." One of the younger bikers raised his hand like a schoolboy. "Could you teach us some of those riding techniques, sir?" he asked respectfully. The others nodded eagerly. Harold looked at their faces, no longer threatening, but eager to learn. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "these old bones might not be up for demonstrations, but I could certainly explain a few things." For the next hour, Harold shared the Ghost Rider's secrets of smooth riding, proper balance, and respectful road conduct. The Red Vipers listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed genuine interest in becoming better riders. Martha came out again, this time with a box of old photographs and newspaper clippings. Found these in the diner's storage room, she said. The original owner kept articles about local veterans. Among the yellow papers was a write-up about the Ghost Riders reunion in 1955. There was a picture of Harold and Spike's grandfather, standing proudly with their motorcycles in front of the very same diner. This diner was a meeting point for veteran riders, Harold explained. We gather here, share stories, help each other heal from the war. Your grandfather was here every Sunday, Spike. Spike stared at the photograph for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. We've been dishonoring his memory, he said, acting like thugs in the very place he respected. The other Red Vipers looked down, shame evident on their faces. One of them stepped forward. We should make this place special again, he suggested. A gathering spot for riders who respect the history. Harold watched as these young men, who had caused him so much trouble, began transforming before his eyes. Sometimes, he realized, people just needed a connection to something bigger than themselves to find their way. Your grandfather would be proud to see you carrying on the riding tradition, Harold told Spike, patting him on the shoulder, though he might have suggested a different name than Red Vipers. Spike looked at his gang members, then back at Harold. What if we called ourselves the new Ghost Riders? He asked hesitantly, to honor their memory. Harold felt his heart swell with pride and hope. In these young men, he saw the same passion for riding that had driven him and his fellow soldiers. It just needed to be guided in the right direction. I think, he said slowly, that would be a fine way to honor their legacy. But it comes with responsibility, to ride with respect, to help others, to be worthy of the name. Spike straightened his shoulders, looking more like his grandfather than ever. We won't let you down, sir. Or them. 1 year later, Martha's Diner had become a different place entirely. Every Sunday morning, the parking lot filled with motorcycles, both modern and vintage, the riders gathering to share stories and learn from each other. At the center of it all, gleaming in its special spot, sat Harold's restored Indian motorcycle. The Red Vipers, now proudly calling themselves the new Ghost Riders, had transformed completely. Under Spike's leadership and Harold's guidance, they had become respected members of the community. Their leather jackets now bore a new patch, a vintage motorcycle silhouette with wings, designed to honor the original Ghost Riders. Harold sat in his usual booth, watching as Spike helped a group of young riders learn proper motorcycle maintenance. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Jenkins taking photographs of some children sitting carefully on his Indian motorcycle while their parents watched proudly. More coffee, Harold? Martha asked, though she was already filling his cup. The Sunday crowd keeps getting bigger. Indeed, the diner had become a landmark for motorcycle enthusiasts from across the state. Riders would travel hours just to hear Harold's stories and see the legendary Indian motorcycle that had served in World War II. Little Tommy Davis, now a year older and even more enthusiastic about motorcycles, rushed into the diner. Mr. Thompson, the new display is ready, he announced excitedly. Harold followed Tommy outside, where Spike and Michael stood beside a newly installed glass case near the diner's entrance. Inside, carefully arranged, were photographs of the original Ghost Riders, including Harold and Spike's grandfather. Their medals, patches, and unit insignias told a story of bravery and brotherhood. We found more photos in my grandmother's attic, Spike explained, pointing to several black and white images. She had a whole box of my grandfather's war memorabilia. The display had become a labor of love for both Harold and Spike. Together, they had created a memorial not just to the Ghost Riders, but to all veteran riders who had served their country. A small plaque at the bottom read, "To those who rode for freedom, not glory." Every Sunday, Harold would share new stories with the gathered riders. He taught them about motorcycle history, maintenance tips passed down from wartime mechanics, and most importantly, the values that had guided the original Ghost Riders: respect, responsibility, and service to others. The new Ghost Riders had taken these lessons to heart. They now escorted veteran parades, organized charity rides for local causes, and mentored young riders. Spike had even started a program teaching motorcycle safety at the local high school. Your grandfather would be proud. Harold told Spike as they stood admiring the display. "Not just of this, but of the man you've become." Spike smiled, adjusting his leather jacket, which now looked more like a uniform than a symbol of rebellion. "Couldn't have done it without you, sir. You showed us what real riding is about." As if on cue, a group of motorcycles rumbled into the parking lot. The riders were veterans from a nearby town, having heard about the Sunday gatherings at Martha's Diner. Harold watched as Spike and his fellow new Ghost Riders welcomed them, offering coffee and respect. Michael approached with Harold's riding jacket. "Ready for the Sunday ride, Grandpa?" This had become another tradition. Every Sunday, weather permitting, Harold would lead a slow, dignified ride through town. Younger riders would flank him protectively, proud to escort a living legend. Children would wave from their yards, and cars would pull over in respect. As Harold settled onto his Indian motorcycle, he felt the familiar thrill of the engine rumbling to life. Age had not dimmed his skill or his love for riding. If anything, the years had given him a deeper appreciation for what motorcycles could mean, not just machines for transportation or showing off, but vehicles for building bridges between generations. The morning sun caught his medals as he led the procession of riders out of the parking lot. Behind him, dozens of motorcycles followed in formation, young and old, veteran and newcomer, all united by respect for the road and each other. Martha stood in the diner doorway, waving as they rode past. The display case gleamed in the sunlight, preserving the legacy of the Ghost Riders for future generations. And in that moment, Harold knew that some battles are won not with force, but with wisdom, patience, and the willingness to share one's story. The sound of motorcycles filled the air, not with intimidation, but with harmony. The Ghost Riders rode again, their spirit living on in a new generation of riders who understood that true strength comes from respect, not fear.